Hi, and welcome to the 31st installment of the Dad Project. Glad to have you back, and tonight we'll take a closer look at training aircraft. My dad flew several trainers during his time in the Navy, but tonight's is a little different, the Northrop T-38 Talon. Yep, the Air Force's stalwart supersonic trainer, not the Navy's. On January 22, 1975, my dad would strap in for a hop listed in his logbook as 1A1. In longhand, that translates as daylight visual, unit training, fundamentals. In this case, the emphasis would be on fun. He would be flying with Alex Rucker, callsign Rattler, for a 1v2 Top Gun flight out of Miramar. Rucker was a Top Gun instructor and had developed the first 1v-many air combat exercises for West Coast Fleet participants. Anticipating the introduction of the F-14 and its M61 Vulcan cannon, he would also introduce air-to-air gunnery to Navy F-4 pilots who had only heard rumors that fighters used to have guns. Rucker would use the T-38 single-seat brother, the F-5E, for this training. Now, there are several aircraft I've mentioned before that my dad had very little time in, but the T-38 takes the cake, coming in at 1 hour of flight time and 1 landing. But what a contrast to the subject of the last installment, the C-1 Trader, that on most days didn't even need a catapult to get off a carrier deck. But I've gotten way ahead of myself, so let's get into flight training, trainers in general, and finally the T-38. So, let's get started, but first, you know the drill. Let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Whether a fight is instigated or joined, it is not long before deficiencies in equipment, tactics, or manpower are identified, if not already known. And a peacetime Army, Navy, or Air Force is usually well prepared for the last war, not the next one. World War I had been raging for nearly 4 years before we entered the fray in April of 1917, and as the Doughboys disembarked from troop ships loudly singing George M. Cohan's song Over There, we were beholden to the fight that had raged in those 4 years. We were there to bolster our allies and fight their fight. The Allies were counting on the American industrial might and manpower to sway the battle in their favor. Remarkably, aviation was an area where the Allies were counting on the U.S. to make a major impact. As General John J. Pershing put it in his Pulitzer Prize-winning 2-volume set, My Experiences in the World War, the situation at the time as to aviation was such that every American ought to feel mortified to hear it mentioned. Out of 65 officers and the 1,000 men in the Air Service section of the Signal Corps, there were 35 officers who could fly. Moreover, the 55 training aircraft were all obsolete and were unable to put a single squadron in the field. This was made even more dire as one of the first requests for help came from the French, who urged President Wilson to supply large quantities of aircraft and pilots. Not to disappoint, Congress quickly approved a $640 million appropriation for an Army-drafted program that called for the building of 22,625 airplanes and 6,210 pilots. All the flag waving in the world would not make this an easy task. When war broke out in 1914, the Allies and Central Forces were not much better prepared than the U.S. would be in 1917. The British would enter the conflict with 66 pilots allotted to 4 squadrons. Comparatively, the French were flush, with 138 aircraft and their pilots, while the Germans started the war with 250 planes and their pilots. This is all very well and good until you realize that the collection of aircraft that made up these numbers was a motley collection of types that could barely get out of their own way. Other than the pilots' pistols, these aircraft, for the most part, were unarmed, They were initially considered highly maneuverable spotting balloons. Suffice to say that this quickly changed, and the race was on to develop and produce the fastest, most deadly, and maneuverable pursuit aircraft and bombers. The numbers tell the tale of a weapon that began the war with an ill-defined purpose to a weapon that would become an integral part of the fighting. The French would produce 67,987 aircraft during the war. Of that number, 4,500 would be considered frontline combat aircraft, a considerable leap from the 138 aircraft they entered the war with. The British would be no less prolific, producing 58,144 aircraft, of which 3,300 were frontline aircraft, having begun the conflict with a meager 113 airplanes. The German production of aircraft would be considered impressive, with 48,537 airframes built, except for the fact that their two main adversaries had produced more aircraft by a factor of about 2.5 planes per their one over the course of the war. And now we come back to the main point of this conversation. How do you train the thousands of pilots needed to fly these aerial armadas? And how did the United States do it? By the time the U.S. entered the war, the Allies had been successfully training pilots to fly their aircraft for several years. It was quickly decided by the Army Air Service, then a part of the Signal Corps, to use a system that was already being used by one of the Allies. Whether the French system was ever seriously considered, I don't know. And it would be a visit to a Canadian training facility by a group of Army officers that would convince the Army to use the system developed by the English and Canadians going forward. This system was made up of 3 phases: ground training, preliminary flight training, and advanced flight training. If this sounds familiar, with minor changes, it is a system the Air Force and Navy continue to use to this day, and a testament to its success. What the system provided the Army Air Service with, in its infancy, was an organized approach to flight training that its previously disorganized and disjointed approach was seriously lacking. The strength of the English methodology, as it translated to the U.S. approach, was a streamlined path that allowed instructors to evaluate students with well-defined objectives that provided stop-go points to either disqualify the candidate, move the candidate into a more suitable aircraft type, i.e. pursuit bomber, or to move them along to pursuit squadrons. The first level of the training regimen was ground training. Ground training was where the Air Service hoped to weed out as many unsuitable candidates as possible in the relatively inexpensive environment of the ground schools before they were allowed to waste flight time with instructors and take up valuable space at the expensive air bases. The ground training curriculum would be conducted at colleges and universities around the country. This would initially be held at 6 prominent engineering schools where the Air Service, rightly so, determined that the necessary facilities and academic instructors could be easily organized for the glasswork. It was also quickly determined that the Air Service could do no better than to replicate the Royal Flying Corps' ground school program. Eventually, the original 6 schools, plus the addition of Princeton and Georgia Tech, would matriculate 22,689 cadets, of which 17,540 would graduate with the remainder discharged to take on other duties in the Army. The 17,540 ground school graduates would then make their way to preliminary flight training. Finding space and facilities for the ground school portion of the flight training program was an easy task for the Air Service. However, establishing sufficient resources for the preliminary flight training would prove far more problematic. Preliminary flight training would be complicated by 2 issues. Number 1, sending the graduates overseas to British, French, or Italian facilities was difficult because those facilities were already operating at capacity, leaving very little room for the much-needed American pilots. Secondly, the training facilities available in the U.S. in the early summer of 1917 were severely lacking. An Air Service report stated that until adequate training facilities were built, only 500 students would make their way through the preliminary flight training by the end of 1917. This bottleneck would leave the U.S. well short of the 6,210 pilots promised by Congress several months earlier. Our allies were quick to realize that to get the much-needed influx of new pilots, they would need to, in the short term, make accommodations to get American flyers through preliminary flight training at their overburdened air bases. And following our request, they did just that. Just as importantly, this allowed the Army Air Service much-needed time to build and organize flight training facilities in the U.S. Like all good plans, reality undid much of the good intentions. Red tape would slow the initial group from being sent abroad in mid-July of 1917 until the end of August. The French training fields would manage to push through 444 pilots, including Eddie Rickenbacker. The British schools would graduate 227 pilots. And finally, the Italian flight schools would graduate 406 pilots. The exigencies of war, perhaps desperation is a better term, would see the U.S. building 18 training fields by Christmas of 1917 of the 25 total airfields built by the end of the war. By the time the armistice was signed, 15,627 cadets would successfully go through basic flight training in the U.S., a number well beyond the 6,210 promised for the Allied war effort. What proved even more difficult to achieve was a unified and well-formed advanced training system. All the obstacles faced with the formation and execution of the ground training and preliminary flight training divisions were exacerbated in the final leg of the training tripartite, advanced training. Initially, the lack of adequate training facilities in the U.S. would hamper the smooth transition of graduated ground training cadets into their preliminary flight training. This would be overcome, and the U.S. would have been able to accommodate the advanced training program, but for the lack of experienced and qualified instructors to teach these new pilots advanced flying skills and the aircraft required for this level of training. The pilots with those skills and the aircraft with those characteristics were held fast in the muck and mire of the front lines of the Western Front. Which brings us to the biggest failure of the U.S.'s participation in the air war over Europe, aircraft production. As was noted earlier, Congress appropriated $640 million to produce 22,625 aircraft. The Air Service, quickly realizing the enormity of the problem, would build several large training facilities in Europe, as well as matriculating as many advanced training pilots as they could into the well-established Allied flight schools to take advantage of the equipment and qualified instructors readily available in Europe. By now you're probably thinking, why is he going on about flight training in World War I? First, despite various pitfalls and false starts to get Americans into the fight, with the promise of thousands of pilots and aircraft, what resulted in the short span of 19 months was the establishment of a flight training curriculum where there had been none, and more importantly was the formation of the Army Air Corps. During the war, the Air Service was part of the Signal Corps, a recognition of an earlier belief that aircraft were more akin to balloons and were best used for intelligence gathering. The full import of the potential of aircraft as warfighting machines was still not fully realized during the Great War, and it wouldn't be until the likes of Billy Mitchell and others, during the interwar years, who would demonstrate the destructive capability of aircraft to a skeptical Army brass. But a far more destructive version of the Great War had to be played out before aircraft would truly come into their own. And despite any lessons that may have been learned in the Great War about mobilization and the time between a promise and a delivery, World War II was nearly a carbon copy of the first. This time, though, the United States had an organized and standardized approach to flight training for both the Army Air Corps and the U.S. Navy. The Wright brothers' successful flight of their Wright Flyer for its day was like a man landing on the moon. It was one of humanity's oldest dreams realized. Flying became a fixation in the public's imagination. The first international air meet was held in 1909 in Paris and attracted over 500,000 people over 8 days. The first heavier-than-air air race was held several months before the Paris event in May of 1909. 4 pilots would enter, 2 would start, and neither would finish. However, there was a winner, Léon de Lagrange, because as the rule stated, if no pilot finished the 10 laps of the race, the pilot who flew the furthest would win. Despite the limited capabilities of early aircraft, any number of inventors, the Wrights and Glenn Curtiss included, did their best to convince the military that aircraft should be part of their warfighting plans and equipment. Most militaries were intrigued, but not convinced, as evidenced by the numbers quoted earlier that identified the number of aircraft each major combatant began the war with. It's impossible to say exactly how many aircraft were built before 1914, but it is generally agreed that it is well below 10,000. This makes it even more amazing to think that the 4 major combatants between 1914 and 1918 would produce over 200,000 aircraft. For a bit of context, the French were the leading aircraft manufacturer during the war, producing over 68,000 planes. A staggering 53,000 of those would be shot down, crashed, or damaged. What takes these numbers from the incredible to the pedestrian is what would happen a mere 21 years later. The interwar years were an interesting and exciting time for aircraft development and inventions, sometimes called the Golden Age of Aviation, and following the Great War, the public did not lose their passion for everything aviation. If the Wright brothers' first flight had been the moon landing, then Charles Lindbergh's flight over the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis in 1927 was man's first landing on Mars. His fame and popularity were stratospheric. But while the public was mesmerized by the accomplishments of Amelia Earhart, Wiley Post, Roscoe Turner, and the aforementioned Lindbergh, The Army Air Corps and the aircraft industry was suffering from the demobilization following the war. The military air forces would not experience any of this glory. The Army Reorganization Act of 1920 folded the air service into the Army, being limited to a force of 10,000 men and its budget reduced significantly. In fiscal year 1919, for obvious reasons, the Army Air Service's budget was $925 million. In fiscal year 1920, that appropriation dropped to $25 million. The end of the war and a limited budget also meant fewer aircraft. This would translate into the public sector, and 90% of aircraft manufacturers would shutter their doors. The Air Corps Act of 1926 did its best to reinvigorate the air service by renaming it the Air Corps and setting a goal of 1,800 aircraft and over 16,000 personnel by 1932. But the Great Depression made the reasonable impossible. The grip of the Great Depression cannot be understated. Every aspect of society was affected, and this would include the military. Pilot training steadily dropped through the 30s until it bottomed out with 184 pilots graduated from advanced pilot training in the Army Air Corps and 527 in the Navy. With the rise of Germany and war on the horizon, this would all change. Let's just get to the numbers. The U.S.'s contribution to the Allies in World War I was substantial in all areas, except for aircraft production. In World War II, that was more than made up for. The U.S. would produce 324,750 aircraft, with nearly 95,000 being lost to operational, training, and other losses. Where the U.S. succeeded in World War I was the training and availability of pilots. That achievement was delivered well over tenfold during World War II, with the War Training Service, the Civilian Pilot Training Program, and the Navy all training close to 500,000 pilots. This was an astonishing mobilization of manpower and fortune. By the time my father entered the Navy pilot training pipeline in Pensacola in 1957, the Navy was operating close to 12,000 aircraft, down from the 37,000 aircraft the Navy had operated during the war. Fewer aircraft with fewer pilots to train. But other than massaging here and there, the training program a World War I pilot went through was very similar to what my father embarked on in November of 1957 with his first flight in a T-34, Buno 140757. The major difference would be that the aircraft he flew were developed specifically for flight training. Training aircraft are a breed apart and long-lived. The Avro 504 would be the Royal Flying Corps' most successful trainer of the First World War and beyond. Initially designed as a bomber, its first flew in 1913 and was quickly made obsolete by more able aircraft. However, as a trainer, it managed to be manufactured until 1932, with 11,303 being produced, and finally retired from the Royal Flying Corps in 1934. Similar stories can be told about the Curtiss Jenny, the de Havilland Tiger Moth, the Boeing Stearman Model 75, and probably the best known of the American lot, the T-6 Texan. As mentioned several times in other installments, my dad's first flight in a plane was at the Naval Academy in 1955, and a Naval Aircraft Factory N3N float plane trainer that had first flown in 1935 and was retired in 1961. During World War II, with minor variations, the Navy and Army Air Corps settled on 3 aircraft for their 3 phases of flight training. For primary training, the Boeing Stearman Model 75 would be used. It was a very stable, overbuilt biplane first introduced in 1934, and over 10,000 would be built before the end of the war. For basic training, the fixed-gear Vultee BT-13, first introduced in 1939, would dominate, and like the Stearman, close to 10,000 would be built before war's end. And finally, the North American T-6 would be used for advanced training. It would first fly in 1935, and over 15,000 would be built by the time its production run ended in 1945. The Navy would use it as its advanced trainer until its final training flight on May 21, 1958. The U.S. Air Force retired its T-6s around the same time. The Texan was last used as a trainer by the South African Air Force in 1995. The commonality of Air Force and Navy training aircraft would begin to diverge following the retirement of these aircraft. The divergence of Air Force and Navy flight training and the aircraft needed for their respective training programs began in the mid-50s. The Navy needed an advanced trainer that could take a trainee to a carrier for carrier qualifications. An ability to fly faster than the speed of sound was trumped by the need for an aircraft that could be slammed on a carrier deck again and again. In fact, the Navy has never had a trainer that could exceed the speed of sound. The Air Force, on the other hand, was developing fighters, bombers, and interceptors that were being designed to fly at dash speeds at far above the speed of sound as possible to penetrate enemy airspace. Russian airspace, let's face it, or to intercept any aircraft that made its way to our airspace. Surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, and intercontinental missiles, ICBMs, would put an end to that development arc, and spell the end to the likes of the B-70 Valkyrie, the F-103, the F-107, the F-108, and the YF-12. This esoteric collection, of course, was not the only high-speed aircraft in the Air Force inventory. With the F-102, F-104, F-105, F-106, and the soon-to-be redesignated F-110, the Air Force felt it needed a trainer capable of breaking the sound barrier. In April of 1959, the Air Force got its wish as Northrop test pilot Lou Nelson took the YT-38 Talon on its maiden flight. When the production line closed in 1962, over 1,100 Talons would be manufactured. So, how did the Navy end up with T-38s? I know many of you already know the answer, but bear with me. The backbone of the military is training, constant training. Training with a well-organized set of steps and outcomes as evidenced by our earlier review of pilot training, and that training never stops. For example, a Navy pilot's thrill of his or her initial carrier qualification would be repeated throughout their career anytime their squadron went to sea. For my dad, that would be the initial carrier qual in his S2F on December 10, 1958 on the Antietam. His daytime carrier qual while attached to VS-32 would be on the Hornet on April 29, 1959. His nighttime carrier qual on the Lake Champlain on December 16, 1959. His carrier qual on the Randolph flying the C-1A on June 24, 1965. And finally, daytime carrier qual flying the F-4B on the Constellation, and nighttime carrier qual in the F-4B again on the Constellation before he and VF-151 left for Vietnam on the Coral Sea. And just to drive the point home, my father's last flight in a Navy jet, the RF-8, on February 12, 1977, was an instrument training flight. The carrier qualification requirements and expectations do get adjusted and massaged over time with the introduction of new aircraft, systems, and admirals, but for the most part, it's a standardized procedure. There are often deficiencies outside the normal parameters of a standardized procedure that get flagged when someone takes a closer look at mathematical outcomes. This would be the case in Vietnam. In World War I, the Air Service pursuit pilots would have 544 confirmed kills while losing 166 pilots. This is a kill ratio of a little over 3 to 1. The Air Service felt that their pursuit pilots made a very respectable show of it, and the U.S.'s top ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, would ride his 26 confirmed kills to fame and fortune. A very similar kill ratio by U.S. fighter pilots in Vietnam was considered disastrous and a deficiency that needed to be addressed. The Navy's answer was the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as TOPGUN, that was formed in early 1969 by Lieutenant Commander Dan Pedersen at Naval Air Station Miramar. However, as important as it was to improve a Navy fighter pilot's flying skills versus their adversaries, the brass was not sure of the value of TOPGUN, and Pedersen was given a meager budget, borrowed aircraft, and their office at Miramar was a stolen modular trailer. Borrowed or not, he did have the aircraft he needed. Most critical in the stable were aggressor aircraft that had similar characteristics to Soviet fighters. The first two were Navy A-4s and T-38s borrowed from the Air Force. The T-38 was a placeholder until F-5s could be acquisitioned. All dolled up in a snappy desert camouflage paint scheme, Navy stenciled on the fuselage, it took a very aggressive stance. And until the F-5 arrived, it did its best to mimic the MiG-21. I suggest you read Pedersen's book, Top Gun: An American Story, if you really want to get into the weeds about this fascinating program. Long story short, these early stumbling blocks were overcome, and the program is now considered indispensable. But how did my dad wrangle a 1-hour thrill ride flying the T-38? Short answer, I don't know. I even reached out to Alex Rucker but never got a response. I hope he's well, and you won't be surprised when I tell you I have a theory. When all the engineering stars align, amazing things can happen. The T-38 was just such a creature. Built for one simple reason: advanced training in a supersonic capable aircraft. So simple that there were no hardpoints for external stores and no fuel stored in the wings. Like other successful designs before it, the design team made every effort to minimize weight and to simplify maintenance. Weight reduction was such a priority that its distinctive white paint scheme was used because white paint is lighter than colored paint. Let's face it, most training aircraft would not win a beauty contest, but when the Talon rolled out in 1959, with its distinctive white paint, a very photogenic, beautifully sculpted aircraft was presented. And its performance was put to the test when it set 4 absolute time-to-climb records that had been held by the rocket with a man in it, the F-104. And it is only now being phased out by the bedeviled T-7 Red Hawk program as the Air Force's primary trainer. Additionally, the T-7 is not capable of supersonic flight. And now, back to my theory. Like most weapon systems, the F-14 was not a done deal. The gestation period for most military programs is long enough for proponents to come and go, for budgets to be cut, for budgets to expand, etc. So, as a test pilot, my dad was not only responsible for the test flying, but he was also a salesman. Photo ops were arranged, visits to local and by international dignitaries, orientation rides for Navy crews, things like that. I've mentioned several times before that foreign sales are considered critical by manufacturers to recoup development costs and to move quickly into the profit phase of production. For the F-14, this would lead to the now infamous sale of 80 aircraft to Iran. The Shah's goodwill was so crucial to our Middle East policy that Iranian F-14s were not a dumbed-down version so often offered on the international market. It was the same full-up Phoenix missile-carrying airplane that the Navy was flying. My dad would give an orientation ride to one of the first Iranian pilots to fly the F-14, Captain Kazim Haydarsadeh, at Miramar. And for the briefest moment, my dad had considered moving us to Iran to be a flight instructor. This is my usual long way round to say that this made me think that perhaps my dad had run into Alex Rucker during one of those dog and pony shows. Rucker is not listed in comment sections for any of my dad's F-14 flights, so it wasn't a familiarization flight. The day of the T-38 flight, January 22, 1975, was a Wednesday, so it wasn't a reserve weekend. There was a 3-week gap between the F-14 flights that bookend the T-38 flight, so maybe it was his 2-week active duty for the year. Maybe. My last grasp at straws is that when Rucker was developing his flight curriculum for F-4 pilots transitioning to the F-14 and its Vulcan cannon, my dad, being a former F-4 driver himself, was somehow involved. If nothing else, my dad was a master friend collector, a skill I severely lack, as he was in constant contact with people he had met in every phase of his life. That he and Rucker may have struck up an acquaintance strong enough to enjoy a morning or afternoon of air combat maneuvering wouldn't surprise me at all. After all, the same skill allowed him a few hours of flight time in Concord. But for now, the hows and whys of this flight will remain a mystery. I may never know the hows and whys of this flight, but that's okay. However, I am curious whether he was the one or part of the two for this 1v2 ACM exercise. But flying in the designated ACM airspace off the coast of San Diego for this flight could only be a thrill and lots of fun. My guess is he was flying against whatever Tomcat squadron was located at Miramar in January of 1975, and doing his best to impersonate the MiG-21. Nothing like a good mystery, but next time around I'll be looking at the navalized version of the F-86, North American's FJ-4 Fury. No mystery here, the Fury was one of the aircraft attached to the Navy Test Pilot School in Pax River, one of several airframes used to teach fledgling test pilots the ins and outs of test flying. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 31st installment of the Dad Project. And for the 31st time, as many of you already know, I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the ride. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.